There is a reason today may feel strangely different from an ordinary day. And if you've been trying to understand why your mind feels unsettled, why certain conversations seem harder than they should, or why unexpected inner knowing has been appearing without any obvious explanation, pay close attention because the timing matters. Today, August 19th, carries a very specific planetary event, and I believe its message may cut through all the mental noise with unusual force, especially for 3 zodiac signs that are likely to feel its influence in a way they cannot simply dismiss. Perhaps you have spent the last several days trying to concentrate, only to find your attention drifting from one thought to another. Maybe you begin a conversation knowing exactly what you want to say, and somehow the exchange turns confusing, emotional, or strangely disconnected. Perhaps you have even questioned yourself, wondering whether you are simply tired, overthinking everything, or somehow losing your usual sense of direction. But there is another layer to what you may be experiencing, because the atmosphere surrounding you is already connected to the astrological pattern reaching its strongest expression today. You are not necessarily imagining the mental static, and those unusual moments of instinct may not be appearing without context. There may be a reason certain thoughts arrive suddenly, a reason a particular feeling seems to appear before you can explain it, and a reason your intuition has been speaking in fragments instead of complete answers. Those sudden flashes of recognition, those moments when you seem to know something before your logical mind has gathered enough evidence, deserve attention because this planetary configuration creates a complicated meeting point between rational thought and intuitive perception. To understand why this matters, however, you have to step back and look at the larger celestial landscape surrounding this day. Today is not an isolated astrological moment. You are currently moving through the space between 2 major eclipses, and that larger eclipse season creates the background against which everything happening now becomes much more significant. The total solar eclipse in Leo occurred on August 12th, while the partial lunar eclipse in Pisces is approaching on August 28th. Between those 2 events lies this unusual period of transition, and August 19th places you directly inside that corridor. This is important because eclipse seasons are not simply isolated moments that begin and end within a single day. They can create periods in which changes feel accelerated. Circumstances seem to develop faster than expected, and events that might ordinarily unfold gradually can suddenly demand your attention. It can feel as though life is shortening the distance between realization and consequence. Something that you have avoided examining may become impossible to ignore. Something you assumed would remain stable may begin revealing its weaknesses. Something inside you that has been quietly changing may finally become visible through your choices, reactions, relationships, or thoughts. The Leo solar eclipse on August 12th already opened that process by bringing attention toward identity, self-expression, visibility, and the difference between the person you have learned to present and the person you actually are. If you have recently felt uncomfortable inside an old version of yourself, that feeling may be part of the larger story. You may have noticed that certain roles no longer feel natural, certain expectations no longer motivate you, or certain ways of receiving approval no longer satisfy you in the same way. The deeper question is not simply who you appear to be, but whether the identity you have been carrying still reflects what is true within you. That is why this eclipse period can feel personal. It can expose the distance between performance and authenticity, between what you have been trained to say and what you genuinely believe, between the image others recognize and the inner reality that you may have been quietly protecting. And now, while you are still processing that identity shift, another planetary influence enters the picture. Today, August 19th, at 7 in the evening, Mercury in Leo forms a trioctile, also known as a sesquiquadrate, with Neptune in Aries. This aspect creates a 135-degree angle between the planets. and its placement between the August 12th solar eclipse and the August 28th lunar eclipse makes it function like a connecting thread between the two larger events. The symbolism is especially important because Mercury represents the mental process you use to interpret your world, while Neptune operates through intuition, dreams, subconscious impressions, spiritual sensitivity, uncertainty, and the gradual dissolving of boundaries between what you can prove and what you simply sense. Mercury wants information organized. Mercury wants a sequence, an explanation, a name for what is happening. Mercury prefers something that can be analyzed, communicated, categorized, and understood. With Mercury moving through Leo, that mental energy also becomes more expressive and self-assured. It wants to speak with conviction. It wants its message to matter. It wants to place personal truth into words and have that truth recognized. Neptune in Aries approaches reality from an entirely different direction. Neptune is associated with dreams, intuition, symbolic impressions, subconscious material, spiritual awareness, and subtle emotional signals. While it can also correspond with confusion, illusion, uncertainty, and the weakening of boundaries that normally help you separate one experience from another. Neptune does not always hand you a clear statement. Sometimes it gives you an image, a feeling, a dream, a strange coincidence, or an internal impression that seems impossible to justify with ordinary logic. When Mercury and Neptune meet through this trioctile, the result is not a simple or effortless exchange. This is not an aspect that promises perfectly organized thinking or immediate certainty. Instead, it can create tension between the part of you demanding an explanation and the part of you already sensing something before the explanation exists. That tension can be uncomfortable because you may want to decide what something means before you have enough information to know. You may feel compelled to interpret every signal, every conversation, every unusual feeling, while another part of you remains uncertain about whether the impression is intuition or confusion. This is where the experience can become especially intense. Your logical mind may ask for evidence, while your intuitive side keeps sending fragments. Your emotions may recognize a change before your conscious thoughts can describe it. A conversation may leave you feeling that something important happened even though, on the surface, nothing dramatic was said. A dream may stay with you long after waking. A sudden realization may arrive in the middle of an ordinary moment and make you stop because it feels strangely familiar, as though some deeper part of you understood something before your conscious mind caught up. That is the psychological tension embedded in this moment. The purpose is not to turn every feeling into a prediction, but to recognize that your internal experience may be more layered than it appears. You are moving through a period where identity has already been challenged by the Leo eclipse, while the approaching Pisces lunar eclipse represents an emotional release still ahead. This Mercury and Neptune configuration sits between those 2 points, creating a moment where thought, intuition, identity, and emotional processing begin interacting with one another. That is why the experience may feel like mental static rather than a simple revelation. You are not necessarily receiving a neat answer. You may instead be noticing the pieces that will eventually form the answer. The more you try to force everything into certainty immediately, the more confusing the experience can become. But if you pause long enough to observe what keeps returning, what repeatedly catches your attention, and what feelings remain present even after the surface emotion passes, you may begin recognizing the deeper pattern. This is the kind of astrological moment that can feel like a message arriving through interference, not because the message is absent, but because several layers of your inner world are speaking at once. And as this energy continues to unfold between the 2 eclipses, the connection between the identity changes already beginning and the emotional release still approaching becomes increasingly important, which is exactly where the deeper meaning of this Mercury-Neptune tension begins to emerge in the next part. This is not a smooth mental current, and that distinction matters because what you are experiencing may feel less like receiving a clear answer and more like trying to remember a melody that keeps disappearing before you can hear the entire song. You can sense that there is a pattern underneath everything. You can feel that something is trying to reveal itself. Yet whenever you reach for a precise explanation, the thought becomes difficult to hold. One moment you feel certain, and the next moment you are questioning what you just understood. That restless friction is one of the clearest ways to describe the Mercury-Neptune trioctile. It does not necessarily arrive as one dramatic event that overwhelms you and immediately disappears. Instead, it can accumulate quietly, almost like pressure building beneath the surface, creating a persistent disagreement between the part of you that wants evidence and the part of you that already senses the answer. Your rational mind may insist that you slow down, analyze the facts, organize the details, and make everything make sense. At the same time, your instinct may be pulling you in another direction, telling you that there is something important beneath what you can currently see. Neither side feels willing to surrender, and that internal disagreement can make ordinary tasks feel strangely difficult. You may begin explaining something and suddenly forget where you were going with it. You may know exactly what you meant inside your own head, only to discover that the words coming out of your mouth do not communicate it clearly. You may listen to another person and realize that you are hearing the words, but somehow missing the meaning behind them. Conversations can become especially frustrating because the problem does not necessarily come from dishonesty or bad intentions. Sometimes the issue is simply that the communication channel feels distorted. What one person means may not be what the other person hears. A simple statement can carry an emotional weight that was never intended, while something important can pass unnoticed because neither person knows how to express it clearly. If this has been happening, resist the temptation to immediately decide that something is wrong with you. The scattered quality of your thoughts does not automatically mean that you have lost focus or become incapable of thinking clearly. Within the symbolism of this transit, the disruption itself serves a purpose. Mercury is being pushed outside its familiar preference for neat conclusions, while Neptune introduces a language made of impressions, emotions, symbols, dreams, and subtle perception. The mind is being asked to process information in a way that does not follow its normal sequence. That can feel frustrating precisely because you are accustomed to understanding something by naming it, explaining it, and arranging it into a logical structure. But what if the information reaching you right now is not arriving in that format? What if the first stage is simply recognition, a feeling that something matters, before the explanation becomes available? This is where those strange, intuitive moments become important. Remember the sudden flashes of knowing that can appear without warning, the feeling that arrives before the evidence, the dream that remains unusually vivid after you wake, the coincidence that is so specific that it makes you pause and wonder why it happened at that exact moment, the internal reaction that tells you something about a situation before your conscious reasoning can explain where that reaction came from. These experiences can become more noticeable when Mercury and Neptune interact through this trioctile, because the symbolic boundary between conscious thought and deeper intuitive awareness becomes less rigid. The result can be surprisingly powerful. A realization may arrive while you are doing something completely ordinary. A dream may contain an emotional message that stays with you long after the details begin to fade. A particular synchronicity may catch your attention so strongly that you cannot simply brush it aside. Or you may develop a quiet certainty about a person, decision, or situation that you cannot yet defend with a list of facts, even though the feeling itself remains remarkably persistent. But there is an important distinction here, and it may be one of the most valuable things to understand about this transit. Not every thought that crosses your mind is automatically an intuitive message. Not every coincidence is a cosmic instruction. Not every feeling deserves to become a decision. The invitation is to observe what carries unusual depth and persistence, rather than treating every passing impression as significant. The most meaningful insight may also be the one you would prefer not to receive. Intuition is not always comforting. Sometimes it interrupts the story you have been telling yourself, because the story has become easier to live with than the truth underneath it. You may have convinced yourself that a situation is acceptable because changing it would be inconvenient. You may have explained away a pattern because acknowledging it would require you to make a difficult adjustment. You may have continued believing something because the alternative would force you to reconsider a plan, a relationship, or an assumption about yourself. This is where the psychological tension of the Mercury-Neptune trioctile becomes especially revealing. The uncomfortable realization may not arrive to punish you. It may arrive because a part of you is no longer willing to participate in the illusion that everything is fine when something inside you knows it is not. The irritation of this aspect is subtle but persistent. Rather than necessarily producing the dramatic confrontation associated with a square or an opposition, it can function like an unanswered question that keeps returning. You can distract yourself, but the thought comes back. You can explain it away, but the feeling returns later. You can decide that you are overreacting, yet something inside you continues asking you to look again. That is why the experience can feel like a persistent internal nudge. It does not necessarily force the door open, it simply makes it increasingly difficult to pretend that the door does not exist. Still, discernment matters. If something meaningful strikes you today, whether it is an unexpected realization, an emotional recognition, a powerful dream, or a feeling that refuses to disappear, give yourself enough space to observe it before turning it into action. Write down what happened. Notice what you felt. Let the impression exist without immediately demanding that it become a conclusion. Allowing an insight to breathe can reveal whether it has genuine depth or whether it was simply a passing reaction. What makes this moment especially significant is that these impressions do not exist separately from the larger astrological sequence unfolding throughout August. They may be connected to a much broader process that continues through the remainder of the month, and that is why the days immediately before today deserve attention. 2 days ago, on August the 17th, Mars in Cancer formed a square to Neptune in Aries, and that earlier configuration created a very different but related atmosphere. Instead of primarily disturbing the relationship between thought and intuition, Mars square Neptune can make the experience of taking action feel unusually difficult. You may have wanted to move forward with something, yet felt as though every step required more effort than expected. You may have noticed your physical energy dropping, your motivation becoming inconsistent, or your reactions becoming sharper than you intended. Perhaps you felt unusually defensive around other people, even when you could not identify exactly what had triggered you. Perhaps your body seemed exhausted, while your mind still wanted to keep pushing. Perhaps you knew there were things you needed to accomplish, but the internal fuel required to accomplish them seemed to disappear. Within the symbolism of Mars square Neptune, that experience can resemble trying to move through deep water. Mars represents the impulse to act, push forward, pursue, initiate, and use physical energy, while Neptune introduces uncertainty, diffusion, and a lack of clear direction. The result can be an unsettling mismatch between desire and capacity. You may want movement, but the path feels unclear. You may feel pressure to act, but your energy does not respond in a straightforward way. You may push harder, only to discover that effort without clarity does not necessarily create progress. Actions can become misdirected because the destination itself feels difficult to see. That atmosphere from August 17th forms part of the backdrop for what you're experiencing now, because the confusion around action and the confusion around thought can make the entire period feel heavier than a single transit would suggest. And as we move from that Mars-Neptune tension into the Mercury-Neptune trioctile, on August 19th, the story shifts from struggling to move through uncertainty toward recognizing what the uncertainty may actually be trying to show you, which leads directly into the 3 zodiac signs most likely to feel this energy most intensely. What you may be feeling this week could actually be the aftermath of something that began before you fully understood what was happening. And if you made an impulsive choice over the weekend and have been replaying it in your mind ever since, there may be a reason the question keeps returning. Perhaps you acted quickly, said something without thinking it through, changed your plans, reacted emotionally, or simply followed an urge that made sense in the moment, but feels much harder to understand now. The important part is not whether that decision was right or wrong. The important part is that your mind may still be trying to organize an experience that was already difficult to process on an emotional and physical level. The Mars-Neptune square that occurred on August 17th can leave behind the sensation of having moved through a period where your energy was available one moment and completely inaccessible the next. You may have wanted to act, but lacked direction. You may have pushed yourself forward, only to realize afterward that you were operating without your usual clarity. Now, as Mercury in Leo forms its trioctile with Neptune in Aries today, the mental side of that experience comes forward. Your brain is attempting to give language and structure to something that may not have been logical when you lived through it. This is part of why the combination can feel so disorienting. Your body may still be carrying the heaviness associated with the Mars-Neptune square, while your mind is simultaneously trying to understand emotions, impressions, reactions, and decisions that did not arrive in a neat sequence. Imagine trying to reconstruct a conversation when you remember the emotional tone more clearly than the exact words. That is the kind of internal experience this period can create. You know something happened inside you, but you may not yet know exactly what it means. You may remember how strongly you felt, even if you cannot explain why. You may understand that something needs to change, while still being unable to identify the precise change required. That uncertainty can become frustrating, especially if you are someone who normally solves problems by taking action. But this is where the timing becomes important. The energy is not designed to remain at this level forever. This is a transit, and a transit has movement. It intensifies, reaches its peak, and eventually moves on. The confusion you are experiencing is therefore not a permanent condition. The mental fog is not your new normal, and the emotional heaviness does not have to become your identity. There is clarity on the other side of this period, but getting there may require you to stop fighting the temporary discomfort and allow yourself to experience it without demanding an immediate answer. Sometimes the mind becomes clearer only after it has been given permission to stop forcing clarity. That is especially important now because this astrological pattern is not affecting everyone in precisely the same way. Everyone can experience some version of the mental static, but 3 zodiac signs are positioned much closer to the center of this particular geometry. The trioctile is occurring at 18 degrees Leo and 3 degrees Aries, placing the fire signs directly in the pattern. While Neptune also brings Pisces into the story because Neptune is associated with Pisces. And Pisces has a major lunar eclipse arriving in 9 days. So if you are a Leo, an Aries, or a Pisces, or if you carry significant placements in any of those signs, this portion of the message deserves your attention. For Leo, this is especially personal because Mercury is currently traveling through your sign and therefore moving through your first house, the area associated with identity, self-expression, personal presence, and the way you reveal yourself to the world. From there, Mercury is forming this tense connection with Neptune in your 9th house, the realm connected with beliefs, worldview, higher learning, and the larger framework through which you interpret life. This creates a very specific psychological pressure. The question being placed in front of you is not merely, "What do I think?" but "Does what I believe still belong to the person I am becoming?" That distinction can be far more unsettling than it sounds. Since the total solar eclipse in Leo occurred on August 12th, You have already been moving through a process of redefining yourself. That eclipse began exposing the distance between authentic identity and the version of yourself that may have been constructed around approval, recognition, expectation, or the desire to be seen in a particular way. Now Mercury brings that process into conscious thought, and Neptune introduces uncertainty into the beliefs that may have helped define you for years. You could suddenly look at an old philosophical position and wonder whether you still genuinely believe it. You might reconsider a political view, a religious conviction, or another deeply held perspective and realize that the person holding that belief has changed. This can be deeply unsettling for Leo because your beliefs can become intertwined with your sense of identity. They influence how you lead, how you inspire, how you explain the world to other people, and how you understand your own place within it. When one of those foundational beliefs begins shifting, it can feel as though more than an idea is changing. It can feel as though a piece of the person you thought you were is being questioned. That is why the lesson here centers on intellectual humility. The challenge is not to abandon your convictions or suddenly reject everything you have believed. The deeper invitation is simply to recognize that certainty and truth are not always identical. Sometimes certainty becomes a protective structure. It gives you something solid to stand on when uncertainty feels vulnerable. You may have projected confidence because admitting that you did not know something felt too exposed. You may have believed that leadership required certainty at all times. But this moment asks you to consider another definition of strength. Being willing to say that you do not know can require more courage than pretending you have an answer. Uncertainty does not automatically diminish your authority. In some circumstances, acknowledging what you cannot yet explain can make your understanding more honest. This is especially important if a creative vision or unexpected idea arrives today that appears unreasonable from a purely logical perspective, but feels deeply necessary on an intuitive level. Do not immediately crush it simply because you cannot justify it to someone else. Record it. Observe it. Give it room to exist before deciding what it must become. You do not need to perform your insight for anyone while it is still taking shape. Now, if you are Aries, the instruction changes completely. Your first move is not to push harder. Your first move is to stop and listen. This can be especially uncomfortable for you because the recent Mars-Neptune square has already disrupted the way you normally use your energy. Mars is your ruling planet, and it has just passed through that difficult square with Neptune. At the same time, Mars has been traveling through Cancer, a sign where its direct, assertive nature can become complicated by emotional sensitivity, defensiveness, and heightened responsiveness. That combination may have left you feeling unlike yourself. Instead of the familiar instinct to charge ahead, you may have experienced hesitation, fatigue, uncertainty, or a strange feeling of being disconnected from your usual direction. You may have wanted an obvious target, but everything around you seemed emotionally blurred. Then today, Mercury activates your fifth house of creativity, romance, joy, and passion, while forming the trioctile with Neptune in your first house, the part of the chart associated with your identity and your most fundamental sense of self. This changes the question for you. Instead of asking how quickly can I move, the deeper issue becomes what is my inner self actually trying to tell me before I move again? And that question leads directly into the specific message this transit may be carrying for Aries. There is one question. Aries cannot keep running away from today, and it may be the question that finally explains why all that forward movement has started to feel strangely empty. If you've been pouring your usual intensity into a relationship, a creative ambition, a personal goal, or anything else you have been determined to pursue, pause long enough to look at what you are actually chasing. Is the thing itself real and grounded in reality, or have you become attached to an imagined version of it, an ideal that feels exciting because it gives you something to move toward? That distinction may be uncomfortable, But it matters now because Aries often experiences movement as a form of security. When you are acting, pursuing, building, fighting, or advancing, you feel as though you have your hands on the steering wheel. Stillness can feel much more vulnerable because it removes the distraction of constant action and leaves you alone with whatever has been waiting underneath. Neptune has been gradually weakening that protective armor, and now Mercury in Leo is helping your conscious mind recognize what your body may have already understood. You may have been tired for longer than you admitted. You may have been using activity to avoid confronting a truth that felt inconvenient, disappointing, or emotionally complicated. The exhaustion is not necessarily asking you to become more productive. It may be asking you to stop. That does not mean abandoning everything you care about, and it does not mean giving up on your ambitions. It means creating enough silence to determine whether your next step is coming from genuine desire or from the fear that you must always keep moving. For Aries, that pause can feel almost unnatural, yet today it may be the strongest choice available to you. Your intuition may have been sending signals for some time, but the constant noise of action has made those signals easier to ignore. Today, that inner voice may become difficult to drown out. Listen before you react. Listen before you pursue. Listen before you decide that another burst of effort will solve what has actually become an issue of direction. For Pisces, the experience reaches an even deeper level, because Neptune is your ruling planet, which means major activity involving Neptune can register strongly throughout your everyday life. Neptune is currently moving through your second house, the area connected with income, material security, and your sense of personal worth, while Mercury in Leo is moving through your sixth house, which relates to daily routines, health, and work life. Because of that combination, what you recognize today may not arrive as an abstract spiritual revelation. It may become visible through something practical. Your body may communicate it. Your finances may reveal it. Your schedule may expose it. Your work environment may make it impossible to continue pretending that an existing pattern is sustainable. Pisces has a tendency to give deeply, and there can be a powerful desire to help, accommodate, heal, support, or sacrifice for other people even when the personal cost becomes significant. You may stretch yourself emotionally, physically, or financially because helping others can feel connected to your sense of purpose. There is nothing inherently wrong with generosity, but this transit can reveal the point where generosity has crossed into depletion. You may suddenly recognize that you have been giving more than you can realistically continue giving. Your body could reach a point of exhaustion that demands rest. A misunderstanding at work could reveal how much responsibility you have quietly absorbed that never truly belonged to you. Looking at your finances could produce a sharp moment of clarity about a sacrifice you have been making without receiving anything comparable in return. That realization may hurt precisely because you care deeply, but pain does not automatically mean the realization is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is the first indication that an unsustainable pattern has finally become visible. The partial lunar eclipse in Pisces, arriving on August 28th, makes this even more significant, because it will ask you to release something important, and what you are experiencing today can function as an early indication of that coming emotional process. Your system may already be preparing for a change that has not fully arrived yet. The lesson is remarkably practical. You cannot use spirituality to escape physical exhaustion, and you cannot turn every necessary boundary into something you are supposed to spiritually transcend. If your body is asking for rest, listen to it. If your routine begins breaking down, do not automatically assume that the breakdown is failure. Sometimes the structure has to become uncomfortable before you recognize that it was no longer supporting you. If something cannot continue in its current form, allowing that reality to become visible may create the room required for something healthier to take its place. What is approaching is a deeper form of surrender, not surrender as defeat, but surrender as the willingness to stop carrying what has become too heavy. You have been holding too much for too long, and this moment can begin teaching you that putting something down does not make you weak. It may be the first honest act of self-respect you have allowed yourself in a long time. Now, regardless of whether you are Aries, Pisces, Leo, or another sign entirely, there are several ways to move through the mental and emotional haze of today without making the situation harder than it needs to be. First, be careful about making major decisions from only one side of your internal experience. Do not rely exclusively on logic, but do not surrender completely to intuition either. Mercury and Neptune are creating tension between those two forms of perception, which means neither should automatically be treated as the complete answer right now. If you suddenly feel that you must sign something, commit to something, or end something immediately, give yourself at least 48 hours before acting if circumstances allow it. Urgency can feel convincing when the mind is surrounded by uncertainty, but the need to act immediately is not always proof that immediate action is necessary. The atmosphere will change, and greater clarity can emerge once the intensity begins to pass. Second, respect intuitive impressions without allowing them to become unquestioned facts. If you experience a powerful gut feeling, a vivid dream, or an unexpected flash of insight, record it. Give it attention. Let yourself wonder about it, but also allow reality to confirm or challenge what you sensed before you build a major decision around it. Neptune can open access to subtle perception while simultaneously making the signal harder to interpret, and both sides of that experience can exist together. An impression can feel meaningful and still require verification. Finally, give the excess mental activity somewhere constructive to go. Creative expression can provide an especially useful outlet during this transit, because writing, painting, music, journaling, and other forms of creation allow material from the subconscious to surface without forcing it into a rigid, logical structure. If you have been wanting to write something, create something, make music, paint, or simply put your thoughts onto paper, this can be a powerful time to do so. The connection between conscious awareness and imagination can feel unusually open, and instead of fighting that openness, you can use it. The deeper lesson here is that truth does not always arrive as a perfectly organized argument. Sometimes it enters through an emotion you cannot explain, a symbol that stays in your memory, a dream that refuses to fade, or a quiet inner recognition that keeps returning, no matter how many times you attempt to dismiss it. The most important insight may even be the one that interrupts the comfortable explanation you have been using to make your current circumstances easier to tolerate. If something arrives today and continues asking for your attention, especially if it challenges a story you have been telling yourself because that story feels safer, do not immediately reject it. Observe it. Give it time. Let reality test it. If the message remains present after the emotional intensity settles, it may be worth listening to more carefully. And if you have stayed with me through this entire exploration, I genuinely appreciate that you chose to spend this time here. If this experience has reflected something you have been feeling throughout the week, consider subscribing for more astrology and spiritual guidance, and share what has been happening in your own life in the comments. I want to know whether you have experienced the mental fog, the unusual intuitive impressions, the vivid dreams, or those moments of knowing that seem to arrive without an obvious explanation. Your experience may be different from someone else's, but recognizing that we are moving through the same larger astrological period can make the process feel less isolating. Take care of yourself while this energy moves through. Give yourself room to pause before reacting, and allow the clarity that follows this temporary fog to reveal what you could not yet see clearly today.